Hello from a very rainy Boston, and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Curt DiCamillo, the curator of fine art at American Ancestors and the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Today, Ken Turino, longtime curator and educator at Historic New England, will present an illustration-rich lecture on the state of historic sites across the United States. Ken's presentation will draw upon the 2019 book he co-authored, Reimagining Historic House Museums, New Approaches and Proven Solutions, which examines issues facing historic houses in these rapidly changing times. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many of them as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. As manager of community partnerships and resource development at Historic New England, Ken Turino oversees community engagement projects and exhibitions throughout the organization's New England properties. He's also an award-winning filmmaker whose programs have been shown on PBS, including Back to School, Lessons from Norwich, Vermont's one-room schoolhouses. A former president of the Boston Camerata, Ken co-produced the group's 2019 CD, Treasures of Devotion, European Spiritual Songs, circa 1500. He is a frequent consultant on interpretive planning and community engagement at historic sites throughout America and serves on the faculty of the Museum Studies Department at Tufts University, where he teaches courses on exhibition planning and reimagining historic house museums. An author who writes frequently on interpreting historic sites and LGBTQ history, Ken is currently working on a book on the history of Christmas. How exciting is that? Please join me in welcoming Ken.
Thank you, Curt. I'm delighted to be with you here today. As you all heard from that wonderful introduction from Curt, that I, along with my co-editor, Max van Balgooy, produced this book, Reimagining Historic House Museums. And today what I want to do is talk about some of the lessons that we've learned from that book, which has multiple authors, and the workshops that Max and I have been doing across the country. I want to go in depth about the status of historic sites today. I'm going to be drawing from resources around the country. I'm going to be giving you lots of mini case studies as we go through this presentation. And I'm going to start with the number of historic houses. And as you can see, there are many. Virtually every town or city has a historic house museum in the United States. And for that matter, I would say Great Britain too. The American Alliance of Museums tells us that there are over 15,000 historic house museums. Now, just to put that in perspective, there are only about 15,000 Starbucks in America, and you know how ubiquitous those are. So that gives you a little bit perspective. There are a tremendous range in the historic houses that we have, and there are more and more coming online, such as this one, Prince's Extraordinary Residence and Production Complex in Minnesota. And then the Paulie Murray House, which just came online during COVID. Now, I want to just start here because with most historic sites, any historic sites, you really have to start with the mission of the organization. That's of utmost importance. And I want to read you just a bit of the Paulie Murray Center's mission. They engage a diversity of residents to lift up the vision and legacy of activist, scholar, feminist, poet, and priest, Paulie Murray, in order to tackle enduring inequities and injustice in our community. That is the purpose of this historic house. For those of you who don't know Paulie Murray, she was a civil rights activist, and she was the first African-American woman ordained as an Episcopal priest. She had open relationships with women. She was denied access to Harvard Law School because she was a woman. Fascinating character here. But that's just one of the new sites coming online. Many, though, are more like this mansion in North Carolina. It was the home of a wealthy industrialist, Joseph Silverstein, whose family came to the county in 1902. And this house was threatened with demolition when a group of concerned citizens saved it literally from the wrecking ball and turned it into an 8-acre county park. This house you see has 33 rooms. Some of them are museum rooms. Some of them are rented out for income, used for art exhibitions. They also have a playground on the grounds and so on. But one of the most interesting houses, I think, coming online, and there are many, is Manukin. This was the home of Francis Lightfoot Lee, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and his wife, Rebecca Taylor Lee. This is a National Historic Landmark, and a Boston architectural firm, Silvetti Mikado, is looking at reinventing this. They are reimagining this house to include the landscape and turn it into a 500-acre classroom and an educational and environmental experience. If you go to their website, you can see a film about how they are going to replace all the missing bits with glass. So you'll be walking on a glass floor. So you can see this construction of this house. The quarters of the enslaved are still there. Really a fascinating site. Lots of challenges. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's a couple hours from DC, and it's about an hour from Richmond. But fingers crossed this is going to move forward. The Dr. Oliver Bronson House in Hudson is owned by Historic Hudson. This has been, up until fairly recently, a little known house. Originally, it was a federal style house, but Alexander Jackson Davis, turned it into a fully realized romantic picturesque estate for Dr. Bronson. It's little known because it's actually on the grounds of a penal colony. Historic Hudson has taken it over, hopes to develop the land around it, and are preserving it right now as a ruin. I've been fortunate to go to an event that they hold every year called Design Hudson, where they invite artists, designers in to reimagine the space. And you can see costume hanging from the ceiling on the right. They also hold concerts and so on. A house that I've had the fortune to work on with my students at Tufts is the Kennedy family Cape House, also known as the Kennedy Compound. This house, at the death of Edward M. Kennedy, came to the Edward M. Kennedy Institute in Boston. And it is an iconic house, but it's also in a small cul-de-sac. It's in a residential neighborhood. There is no parking. Ethel Kennedy still lives next door and keeps an eye on everything that goes on. Edward M. Kennedy's son, Teddy Jr., lives right behind it in what was JFK's house. The question is, what does this become? Does it become a museum with some of those limitations? My students at Tufts for the last several years have been exploring the house. The Institute has been very generous to let us come and tour. It's not a museum. So here you see we recreated the iconic photograph of the family. You can sit on the furniture at this point as the Institute decides what is going to happen to this house. Might it become a think tank? Might it become a museum? Still questioned. But you know, a lot of houses, like the next one, are just waiting for the future. And this house has been waiting for the future for a long time. When I drive up to Hudson, New York, I've been going by this sign for many years. So a lot of houses are coming online, a lot still in limbo. Now, as part of the workshop that Max and I did, we asked participants, what are the biggest challenges for your historic house museums? And I hope to give you some insight into that. And here you can see, and I'm not going to read this, but you can see in the red bolded what people felt: boards, support, attendance, relevancy, of course, docents, volunteers, support being cash. These are some of the challenges that all museums face today. A lot of that focuses around financial instability. And a lot of museums lack an endowment, historic sites we're talking particularly, lack of grant funding. They depend too much on earned income, what we call the gate. And that is and has consistently been a problem. Now, I want to give you a little case study here with the Edna St. Vincent's Millais farmhouse, steeple top. And this is where she spent a lot of her life in upstate New York. A few years ago, I want to read you a quote that at that point, Vincent Elizabeth Barnett, the president of the organization's board of trustees, wrote in a statement in the New York Times, quote, "The cost of operating the site, even with a small staff and an extremely tight budget, exceeds the money brought in each year from donations and visitor fees." So the New York Times article said, unless they raise $1 million, they would close. Well, if you want to throw in the chat or your question, your guess, I can tell you though, they did close. And right now, as of today, they are on transition and moving away from a traditional historic house museum. Their goal, though, is to preserve the building. That is very important. A lot of museums are also talked about for years declining attendance. Since 1982, for many years, that was the case. But I'm going to come back and talk about this in just a little bit in the near future. A lot of sites are suffering from poor stewardship or deferred maintenance. Preservation is expensive, and how we present ourselves as historic sites to the public has real meaning if we are not good stewards. And you know what? A lot of people think the historic site, historic house experience is not very good. Linda Norris has a wonderful blog post you can see there called The Uncatalogued Museum. She also works for Sites of Conscience. And this is the reasons she found for people, in her words, hating house museum, lack of connection to the present. And who wants to stand around for an hour while you're learning about a person who has essentially nothing in common with you? And you know, how many house tours have you been on where you've heard this is the best Chippendale chair in America? Or this is the best Townsend Goddard chest on frame anywhere in America. And that's also echoed in Frank von Goen and Deborah Ryan's book, The Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums. Now, not everyone is on board with what Frank and Deborah have to say, but I think there's a lot of truth in their findings. And this is what they had to say, which echoes what you just saw previously. Nothing relevant to contribute. They're boring, narrowly curated. In addition, he says they are elitist, insular, self-referential, and culturally old-fashioned. Well, I'd like to get Curt's take on that at some point. And you know what? A lot of people do feel that way. But I promise you I'm going to be positive about some of the reasons people are down on historic sites. You know what? A lot of us tell exactly the same story, whether it's spinning, whether it's butter churning, or whether it's candle making. We do. That part is true. What we say with our historic sites is we really have to find what our important story is that will engage our communities. Now, I want to go back and talk a little bit about attendance because I showed you the decline. Well, there is good news here. There are 3 studies that came out in late 2019, pre-COVID, Humanities Indicators and the National Park Service, which we're seeing, which show attendance actually has been rising. And you know what? It's rising at sites that are telling more inclusive stories, according to the Park Service. And that might include the Charles Young Buffalo Soldier site in New Mexico, and the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. And the American Association for State and Local History, and a study that came out in November 2019, I can show you their findings in the next slide, which shows, look at this. History museums and historic sites and historic houses are all on the upside. This is great news. And again, I think it has to do with the historic sites have now gotten away or trying to get away from the boring tours and a lot of what Frank Van Goon had to say about being bad. I will tell you that visitation is on the rise, and that's good news. But then what happened? Well, you know what happened, and that was COVID. The American Alliance of Museums predicted that 1/3 of museums in the United States would go out of business. Well, I'm happy to report now that that is wrong. That is not true. Museums tended to be resilient and pivoted, a word you've heard a lot, over the last year with virtual programming and on. And now that the country is opening up, attendance, people have bent up energy, are getting out there. So that's good news. And there's also more good news to know coming out of this. But look at this. This was a survey done by La Placa Cohen, which showed what people trusted most in where they got their news. And look what's at the top. History museums and historic sites. Thank you, right there. Look where the US government is. It's pretty far down there. That's good news we can use at our historic sites. And you know what? We can no longer think of our sites as encased in glass. And this is actually one I found in Tigres outside of Buenos Aires that was encased in glass. Our houses have to grow and they have to be willing to change our structure and programs and services. You know, the focus of what I'm telling you about today is about community engagement, sustainability, and relevance. And look at simple things. When can most people visit a historic site? It's on weekends when you're doing other errands or you're on holiday. But what about after work or in the evening? We've experimented with that at our Otis House Museum in historic New England, opening up right after work to allow people to come in for a tour and then maybe go to dinner. But also, we're so used to do not touch, you know, do not take photographs, you know, keep off your phone. Well, look at this. This is from the National Trust in Britain, and it's about being engaging and welcoming. We also have to seriously consider issues of accessibility. Our Eustis Estate, we've made ramps to get people in, and we put in a lift to get people into the second floor. And there are other examples of ADA accessible historic sites. We have to. It's a big hurdle. Also think about comfort. Many of our sites aren't going to be air conditioned. It's not necessarily good for buildings. Here at Presterold in Clarksville, Virginia, which is, when I went there, I felt like I was in a swamp. They did something simple, which was just give you fans that you could use to make you feel more comfortable. And do you know, up until 5 years ago, Historic New England did not allow people to take photographs of the historic house. Well, you can probably know that that was a mistake, and we've changed, we've learned, as a lot of sites. This is one, the Alexander Major's house in Kansas City, where Max and I taught, that allows that, encourages it, because you get free advertisement through social media. And you also have to learn and know about your visitors. This was from a study Historic New England did, where people, our members and our visitors, got their information. So this is where you're going to get the word out. Also, the American Alliance of Museums did a study nationwide asking people what they want. Well, look what's at number at the top, having fun, but also interesting content, and I might say relevancy there and experiencing new things. And we've done that at Historic New England. This was a study that we did, which echoes that with our members. Our audiences want things that are fun, social, interactive, and relevant. So go beyond the lecture. What are other things? And I'm going to show you an example at one of our sites, Walter Gropius's modernist masterpiece that we own in Lincoln. And we allow visitors to come in small groups for something we call Hips and Sips. It's an evening tour and reception with food. You can even have a band on the roof, a jazz band if you like. I've rented this out for 2 groups I'm involved with. Seeing a site at night lit up, experiencing food and drink is a wonderful way of seeing these sites. And you know what? Our historic sites must no longer think of the Velvet Rope Tour as the only way you see a site. And I want to give you an example of this house in St. Paul, Minnesota, that was your typical house museum with the velvet ropes, the stanchions. They decided to reinvent it, and they decided to take down those stanchions and show you a room as it would have been experienced by the owners, and walking into it. It had a profound effect on the visitors and the staff. Now, this site also went to a new model, a new business model. They weren't open regularly for tours because they didn't get a lot, but they decided to be open just for events. They kept their Victorian Christmas, and they added things that were social, like we heard people wanted, History Chef. And also something that's been copied across the United States now, History Happy Hour. This is done the last Thursday of each month. Every single one since this opened several years ago has sold out. And what it is, it's a monthly event where they partner with a restaurant next door for food. You get tickets for drink. You get about 15 minutes of history. Here they're looking at the daguerreotypes, getting a little history of photography, stereopticons, and socializing and having a drink. What a great way to experience a house. More and more houses like the Thomas Cole in upstate New York, Thomas Cole being the founder of America's first major art movement, known as the Hudson River School, are now offering you an option. You can go on a guided tour, or you can experience it on your own. Here, when you walk into the first room, when you walk in, you sit down, the frames are empty, and then all of a sudden projection comes up and you learn about Cole's painting and his relationship to the Hudson River through that. What a great experience. Then as you walk into the next room on a guided tour of your own, the labels are essentially these books. You go up, you explore, and you start reading, and you realize you're reading about the room. And then you notice this projection on the desk there. You walk up to it, and they're projecting down from the ceiling. You have Thomas Cole's own words and images of him, his family, and life. And then making this more relevant, it was the home of an artist. They used the upstairs for contemporary artists. This one from the Hudson Valley, and this one being a well-known artist, Kiki Smith. So again, it's keeping the relevancy today. We also, though, and this is really important, need to tell more diverse and inclusive stories. And Historic New England, as you heard from Curt at the very beginning, owns 38 historic sites. And you can see a little snapshot of those in our next image there. And go into the next one too. Thank you. There you can see our sites. Would you know, at our sites, like many, we typically told the stories of wealthy white men and sometimes the women. But you know what? We're changing, and so is the world. The next slide I'll show you is from Monticello, I think well known to many of you. They too, for over 25 years, have been grappling on the best ways to tell these stories of the enslaved people. On the bottom of the image, you see what's left of Mulberry Row, where the enslaved live. This was one of the most incredible tours I've been on in my life. The guide had a very mixed group of different ages, very diverse group. And he told people, I'm going to talk about uncomfortable history. And he did. And he said, you know, if you ever need to step away or leave, please do. And he was so engaging. So the tours are adapting as their interpretation. Just in 2018, Monticello decided to open the quarters of Sally Hemings. These were right below the main house, connected by a staircase to Thomas Jefferson's quarters. And they decided to tell the story of Sally Hemings and her and Thomas Jefferson's children. They didn't have an image, so they used these projections. And they decided to tell the story through the words of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' sons, which he wrote this, talking about mom and dad. And white historians had suppressed that and refused to believe it. But now we're going back and telling the stories through the descendants' own language and words. Another site, really important, is Monticello, which did extensive archaeology of the enslaved quarters. And here you can see that. And they were one of the leaders in talking with the descendants. And in the next, one of the cabins they restored, you actually can press the button you see on the bottom there where it says listen. And here, one of the descendants tell the stories that have been passed down in their family about being enslaved here at Mount Pelier. And you can see they've tried to connect this to today. Slavery still exists. The last time I flew, which was a while ago, they were talking about human trafficking over the loudspeaker. That's slavery. That still exists today. So again, making these stories relevant. They also do that in an award-winning exhibition about the Madison family and how they enslaved people over 4 generations. Very interactive, very emotional exhibition. Other stories we can tell. Campbell House in St. Louis is where Max and I did one of our workshops. And this room was the last descendant's only room that he lived in this house. And his name was Hazlitt K. Campbell. And the story that they tell here is the fact that he had a mental illness. He lived in this room. This is a contemporary newspaper account, which called him, in their words, peculiar. Do you know that 19.1% of US adults experience mental illness? And we don't tell those stories in our sites. And you know what? I can name several where it is the case. And it wasn't thought polite. But these are stories that are relevant. 1 in 5 Americans today has mental illness. Now, this was a site that's won national awards, the Bradford House, and it was under construction when the captain, Gresham Bradford, was captured by the French in the War of 1812, and his wife supervised the building of the house, and then it was lived in by her and her daughters for most of the 19th century. And as you go into the house, you learn about the daughters. You also learn about disability history, which we don't hear, like mental illness history in the house. And then you hear about the daughters' accomplishments as nurses in the Civil War, as activists, as you can see. This house is set up, you go through it on your own. There's someone there to answer questions. And in the next slide, you can pick up letters and read some of the family's stories. And it talks about the women, and it talks about their Civil War service. And I love in the next displays how they talk about, they look at what's on the walls, look at how things are displayed, not your traditional house museum. They even have something for talking about the fact that visitors came, including prominent abolitionists, and they related to today by asking you, the visitors, so what do you fight for today? We know what people fought for who lived in this house. What do you fight for today? Yes, and we've gotten very good at telling the story of servants. Bruce Moore is a national trust for historic preservation property that focuses on the local tourists, not a lot of not a lot of tourists, they focus on the local citizens, but they give tours in costume exploring the life of the domestic servants. And I have to say, more and more historic houses have really taken this up because people want to hear those stories. They relate more to the servants in many cases. Now, one of the most popular history museums in America is Tenement Museum, and I think known to many of you. Last time I went there, I spent an entire day in 4 different tours, which are conversational, engaging. This was home to nearly 7,000 working class immigrants who faced many of the challenges immigrants face today. And this was threatened by COVID, but indications that it is coming back to what it was. Now, this building explores the lives of Greek immigrants, Italian immigrants, and others. This only went up to 1938 when the building closed. But just a few years ago, they opened this building, which was the residence of people post-World War II who lived in that community, the Lower East Side, and it tells the stories of Holocaust survivors, Chinese family, Latinx family. The room that you're seeing that's covered in plastic with a red chair, that was part of the Latinx family. And the guy turned on the television and there was an oral history of the people who actually lived in that space talking about their family. Really engaging and really wonderful. Now, this is happening across the United States. In Tucson, this family, this house belonged to one family who acquired it in 1896. It had been lived in by white settlers before, but preservationists took this house by eminent domain away from the family and told the story for many, many years just of the white colonial settlers. That has now changed. It's owned by the Tucson Museum of Art, who are reinserting the Cordova family that owned this back into the narrative, into the story. And you can hear just different stories. This is one of my favorite sites. If you ever go, please check it out. It's a preserved ruin. And they tell some difficult stories, one of which has to do with sex in prison. And the images you're seeing at the bottom right were actually done by contemporary artists to tell the story of transgender people in prisons. And some of it rather harrowing. And there was a warning label that told you that this is going to be sensitive material and that if you were not comfortable, not to go. But these are stories that deserve to be told. And at the Gibson House in Boston, they've started, like many sites, telling the story of queer men and women. They do a pride tour. The woman on the left, Barbara, is one of my students. I was very pleased to be part of the focus group here. So they're not doing this just at Pride. They're doing this throughout the year. They also do servants tours here. So these are stories that we need to tell. And moving on, because we had our little glitch, I want to tell you a little bit that museums can't do this without financial sustainability. It seems obvious. We need to start charging for our programs. We can do that in any number of ways. Historic New England owns one of the country's oldest greenhouses, and it's operational. It's open year-round, but we do plant sales and orchid sales to raise money for our sustainability. And we put out a paint line, which is very popular, of historic colors of America. And that we get checks yearly from that. Now, functions are a challenge for most historic sites. I love attending them. They're beautiful. This is in New Bedford, where many sites host weddings. And concerts and other kinds of events. Christmas is big. That's on the left. The large slide on the left is our Eustis Estate, and the two on the right are Blythewald. These are big money makers, but they're also, they bring family memories. There's lots of reasons for doing these here. Other events that you can do that can bring in money is, this is in New Orleans, the Herman Grima and Gallier House commissioned a play set in 1874 called The Uninvited, which is a true story of a group of men who tried to resegregate the integrated school next door. And the play takes place throughout the house moving through it. What a great way to use a historic house. Other examples include, food and wine and craft beer events. I always attend this one at Strawberry Bank. You're enjoying the grounds, but also you can have something to eat and have some wine. Again, social, but it also is very profitable. Now, on Halloween, these ghost tours are very, very popular, and I'm going to come back to them. At the Molly Brown House in Denver, I've actually seen this all decked out. This is hugely popular, but they keep to mission by telling stories from authors of the day that Molly Brown would have had books in her house by Edgar Allan Poe and other Gothic masters. And they have characters throughout the property and in the house to tell stories. Rentals are another way. This was one of our houses in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the Langdon House, where it got rented as a CD release party for a punk band. Well, there was no furniture in the room. There were rugs. So was it doing any damage? No. But we'll come back to this. Film rentals. This is, some of you might recognize the character. This was the rental at the Gibbs House. They also used our historic New England sites and others in New England for Little Women. Can be big money makers, but you have to have all your policies for weddings and for these in hand. Fine arts crafts and fairs. This is a huge moneymaker and gives people enjoyment too. What a great way. Also, ride the food wave. This is a farmer's market up in Maine at a historic site, also known as Black House. It brings in community, it brings in money. Programs. This is a course that I've ran for a decade called the Program in New England Studies, which looks at New England architecture and material culture. But it's on top, it's tied directly to our mission of teaching. But you really do need to be careful that things relate to the mission. And I read you some earlier. Was having a CD release party a bad thing in our Langdon House? Using it for yoga, I don't necessarily think that that's bad. It gives people enjoyment, another way to experience a historic site. But you do have to be careful. Because on some of these ghost tours, the one on the top, which was the Stowe Center in Hartford, was perfectly tied to mission. The one on the bottom, not so much. They gave you a ghost meter and it was kind of iffy. So you do have to be careful. Now, not all sites can be museums. These sites on the canal quarters, C&O Canal in Maryland, going to Georgetown and Washington, D.C., these buildings were essentially boarded up and derelict. When a friends group got together, reinvigorated them, restored them, and now rent them out as holiday rentals. Each is filled with information about that particular site and who lived there, guidebooks to walk. I rented it, and I invited my graduate school teacher in the bottom, friends from Mount Vernon and from the Smithsonian, and Max, who is holding the plate, my co-author and his wife, to this. It was a wonderful way to experience these sites. It's just amazing. And we at Historic New England have started doing that with one of our properties up in Wiscasset, Maine, where we restored one of the bedrooms that had been in the caretaker's house, caretaker section, and now working with an organization, rented out. It's a great way to experience a house. And there are other ways to experience them. This is my current kit, so I'm going to go through these next couple slides very quickly. Artist in residence programs. This is owned by the city in Boise. This is our Langdon House in Portsmouth, where we work with the African-American artist you see on the right of both images to tell an untold story. The artist is Richard Haynes, of one of the servants in the house, and he ended up painting a portrait of him, now in our collection. And then this site in New York, Reggie Black, a contemporary artist, did an exhibition, not so much an artist in residence, but to call attention to the history of slavery at the farmhouse, which is not well known with this projection that you can see right from the street. Now, the heart of what I want to talk about is experimenting and collaborating with, we need to take risks at our sites. Here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe, which I've referred to, it was a typical Victorian house when they decided that they were going to look at new ways to tell the story. The mission of this site, and I do want to tell you that, is to promote vibrant discussion of Stowe's life and work and inspire commitment to social justice and positive change. That's their mission. So they decided little intervention. They brought in folding chairs. They covered them with period-looking fabric. They held focus groups, and they found out people wanted to sit in this historic site, and they wanted to talk. And that became their new signature tour, which is all conversational. This is a tour I was on, where as one of the rooms, you go into the living room, you sit down, you pick up reproductions of documents of the day, and you have a discussion with the guide. What were the prominent issues? Well, you know, enslavement was one, and something that Stowe was concerned. As you go through the house, there are projections. That's right above the desk where she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Then in the last room you see, they put a reproduction table, covered it with cloth, and allowed people to write their thoughts and comments on the table. What a great way and a different way to experience it. Other sites that do things like that are Lincoln Cottage in Washington, D.C. Lincoln spent 1/4 of his presidency at this hilltop location to get away from the literal swamp of downtown Washington, D.C. And here on the signature tour, visitors in small groups use historical voices, which might be projected on the wall or sound, to learn about Lincoln and his family life there. I hope you noted that people were actually sitting on the furniture. This came unfurnished, so they brought in period furniture and allowed people to sit, again using projections and so on, that you can see here. And that's with an amazing guide. They also have a visitor center where they try to relate the issues of the day with what's going on, the issue of Lincoln's Day with what's going on today. Modern slavery, human trafficking I mentioned. So relating the issues of the past to today is a big theme that you find in many museums. Now, many people don't know that the only surviving Benjamin Franklin house that he lived in is in London, and he lived in there for 16 years, became personal friends with the owner and her daughter, who ended up moving to Philadelphia. Her descendants are there today. This is a signature experience with a costumed interpreter. The house is unfurnished with just props, and they use projections and Franklin's words to tell the story of his London years. I was in tears literally at one point. They also, you know, none of these places are perfect. They can never have more than 40 people in that house at any one time. There's only one central staircase. The top floor they use as educational programming space where students can recreate and tourists the experiments that Franklin did, like the glass harmonium when he was in London. Now, this next site, many people consider the most exciting historic house in the world. I hope it's known to you. It's a journey through time of the fictive Jervis family, who were Huguenot weavers. This section in London was home to the weavers. What I love about this house and what many lessons we learned, look at, you've got fires going, you've got real food not growing, food cooking in there. So you get the smell. So you experience it and walking through on your own. There are bits of paper that tell you some of the story of this family's rise and decline. It's playful. It's not 100% historically accurate. How many places do you know that have a real cat that might come around and brush your feet. Or how many historic houses have you ever been into where the bed's unmade? It feels alive, and that's what they were trying to get at. It was disdained by the National Trust in England when it originally opened, and now, well, you'll see what lessons they've learned in just a couple minutes. And we all have at our sites. You know, normally when I'm doing this live, I ask people to raise their hand and tell me whose house this might be. I love it because it seems alive. There's the laundry out. This was the house of the only American president whose first language was not English. And I will tell you, this is in upstate New York. So you can probably guess that the language was Dutch, and that would be Martin van Buren. But again, making our historic sites alive. And I love the fact that in Portsmouth, when you go to the Moffat Ladd House, you also have the chamber pots, but this one actually has some liquid. And the then director, Barbara Ward, told me that pouring a can of 7-Up makes the best pee. But again, making our sites alive, flowers, food, smell, amazing. I'm not talking a lot about first-person interpretation with actors, but here, this is one of the best at Strawberry Bank in Portsmouth. This is Mrs. Shapiro, and she keeps a kosher kitchen. And when you go in, there will be oil with the smell frying, and she will be making latkes. And that, when she throws the batter in, the crackle just explodes. Really, really amazing. And also, you know, Swan House in Atlanta, where Max and I did our workshop, has a timeout room for kids. If you're coming with your family, kids might, you know, need to play a little bit. So you let them loose. I should also say, as an aside, this was the president's house in the Hunger Games, Donald Sutherland's house. So just a little aside there. Also, Handel House is a pretty staid historic house, but they've enlivened it with music, and now they've added a recording studio, and they've changed their name because they've acquired Jimi Hendrix's flat adjacent to it. Hendrix was thrilled to be living in the same row that Handel did, and went out and bought Water Music and some of his other recorded music. That's Jimmy's ex-girlfriend who helped recondition the apartment. So now it's the Handel and Hendrix Society, Handel and Hendrix House in London. So they have a wide range and bringing in a whole new audience. It was packed with 20-somethings when I was there. And this house is a National Trust site. And I want you to look at this class, look at this closely and see what they've learned from one of the other houses I showed you. This was Thomas Carlyle and his family's house that I visited a few years ago. And he wanted to create an unpretentious home. This has a new model. There's a whole chapter in our book devoted to this that the trustees of reservation in Massachusetts have taken on, where they look at the statement of significance and the spirit of place. Now, this is a self-guided tour. When you go in, this is what you see. So you're going to be introduced to these people. And then as you go through the house, well, you'll see there's real food in this house. And as you continue through, there's smell, you know, that's real bread. That's real cinnamon that they've just ground. That's real sweets that you're seeing. And you can learn about the servants and the staff as you self-explore. And look at how they put out some of the information. Some like this, but then some on tea towels, some on pie crust, so that you can discover as you go through the house. They also give you a chance to sit down, pull books off the shelf and relax, or do interactives. This young man is learning to fold napkins, as they might have in that day. Then as you go through, you learn about the characters. The eldest son was a politician, budding politician, but then the war came along. He was also a bit of a dandy, as you can see, in his next room, his bedroom. And there, I was a little taken aback. I'm looking, and something was happening. If you look at the image on the right, you can see next to the paint on the right, you can see a painting of him as kind of a dandy, Thomas. But then A minute later, it transformed and showed him in uniform, and there's his uniform on the bed. So they were using projections. They were also in other rooms showing children, but keeping the labels down by the floor for children and projecting images again, making this house seem more alive. They also allow music. You can sit down and play the piano. That was one of my classmates on my Addingham program who did just that. Having sound, music in a house makes it alive. They also ask your opinion to these historic sites. I love that. With these stickies, you can see one at the bottom. Had they brought it back to life, in my opinion, yes. And you can see they learned lessons from, as many of us have, from the Dennis Seaver's house. Using your landscape, this is one of our properties, and we're getting ready to open a new sculpture exhibition, but enjoying that. This is one that we had a few years ago. One of the best sites I can recommend is Alana in upstate New York. Frederick Church, the artist and student of Cole, considered his house and his grounds his masterpiece. And they really animated it, and to great expense, giving these tours in the cars that they bought and landscape tours, really magnificent, and also populating them sometimes with contemporary sculpture. Other sites that use the land include the Trustees in Massachusetts, and off-season, when many of our sites are closed, animating the landscape with winter lights, and this is one I visited a few years ago, really brings in people. But, you know, I started this by saying it's about community. You have to survive. It's about your community. I'm going to give you a quick mini case study of one of our sites, Pierce in Dorchester. I want you to look that we were not good caretakers of the house you can see in the right, but we stepped up and restored the house for the community. It was kind of an eyesore. And you know, this house was not sustainable. It, in 2003, the early 2000s, had 14 visitors a year. That is not sustainable. So what did we do? We talked to the people in the community. It's across the street from one school. It's a working class inner city community, very diverse. We asked teachers, what do you want? And we listened to what the community told us. They wanted in-school programming. Okay, yes, I know there's a spinning wheel, but we do other things. And they wanted out of school, like archaeology programs. Now we are serving 7,000 families and students. That is a success. That's a big change from the 13, but we listened and learned. I'm involved with the House of Seven Gables, and just last week became president of the organization. They started out, many of you probably know it because of the novel by Hawthorne, but it actually was saved and preserved as a settlement house. And that was to teach the immigrants on ways to earn money, survive, and learn a language. We still keep that mission today with ESL classes and citizenship. We also do community conversations with our groups in town. There's a large Latinx community. So we do issues that are important to the community and have these conversations, which many museums are starting to do. We also did a film series before COVID, and again, working with the Latinx community, hiring people from the community to work for us, and so on. We also, in the summer, run these Caribbean Connection programs for local Latinx community to show the ties between Salem and the Caribbean. So that's adhering to your community. And then community in the broadest sense of the word. This is one of our properties. Beauport, magnificent mansion. But for over a decade, we've been collaborating with Boston's History Project, which is Boston's LGBTQ Historical Society, to tell the story about the builder and designer of this, Henry David Sleeper, as a gay man. So we've been partnering on walking tours. Well, let me show you the interior first, I should. You get to see about 27 of the 40 rooms, each with a different theme on Gloucester Harbor. It's magnificent. So we have many communities. We have our members, we have the Gloucester community, we have tourists, but we have the LGBTQ community as one of our focuses. So we work with them on tours, events, as you see here. to cater to that as one of our communities. So I've taken you on a long ride and very quick. I'm not talking a lot about apps and about technology, but I have to acknowledge that is a way people get information. Ginevra is going to put in the chat a link so that you can pull up all the content on our kiosks in our Eustace House, which I've mentioned a few times, in Milton, Massachusetts. If you put eustace.estate in your browser, you will pull up films that show the restoration. You will learn about the family and the servants and the objects and so on. So I acknowledge that this is an important part of what we do in our sites. But not all sites can be museums. I'm showing you two examples of buildings that were originally museums, but were deaccessioned, let go by their parent organization, and turned back into private homes. Historic New England and a number of organizations and state organizations have stewardship programs where we'll put easements on these properties that stay with that house in perpetuity to preserve not just the exterior, but interior elements. So in some cases, this is the best way. And I'm going to end here with a quote from a dear friend and mentor, Jim Vaughn, formerly of the National Trust here in the States. And he wrote, "Let's think of ourselves not as museum professionals bound by a narrow set of rules. Let's begin to think of ourselves as stewards of places with great power, places that can refresh and nurture the human spirit. Let's put the community needs and visitors' needs right up there with the needs of our collection. And finally, let's realize that if we provide our community with programs that enrich their lives and help them discover and learn about what is special about where they live, I believe we can count on our community to sustain us in the long term." And with that, I want to say thank you all for putting up with our technical difficulties, and I will come back now to see if you all had any questions. So again, thank you for coming.
Good grief, Ken. That was astonishing. I think those of you who don't know Ken can figure out pretty quickly his amazing enthusiasm for his subject matter and his indefatigable energy. Before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming art and architecture programs that I'd like to mention. On Thursday, July 29th, as part of our Summer History Benefit Gala, I will be in conversation with Anthony Amore, Director of Security at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, about his new book, The Woman Who Stole Vermeer. And if you're interested in the IRA and English upper class aristocrats who go rogue, this is something you need to tune in for. On August 12th, I will be co-leading a walking tour of Boston with the city's archaeologist, Joe Bagley. We have, I think, just 2 spaces left on that tour. And for those of you who are worried about being on a tour in a busy city street, we have what are called whisper guides, which enable you to hear through headphones what we'll be saying on the tour. On August 27th, we will have a virtual tour of Weston Park with Gareth Williams. Those of you familiar with My Little World know that Gareth gave us an amazing lecture last month about the country houses of Shropshire. And of course, Weston Park is in Shropshire, and that's where we will be staying, fingers crossed, for the first week in December when we have our Christmas in England. And then lastly, October 30th to October 5th, Hidden Philadelphia. This is, once again, fingers crossed, our first tour for 2021. This is the city of my birth. I will be co-leading this tour with the amazing Jim Mundy, who is a Philadelphia historian, and in a perfect tie-in with something that Ken showed you, we will be visiting the Eastern State Penitentiary. Now, let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type them into the question panel, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time provided. I have to say, as a few footnotes to Ken, because we have to continue to promote Boston, Ken mentioned the trustees, which is formerly called the Trustees of Reservations, which, much to the irritation of the National Trust in England, the Trustees of Reservations here in Massachusetts is the oldest preservation organization in the world, founded 1 year before the National Trust in England. I have to also chime in. Ken mentioned Dennis Seaver's house as being one of his favorites. I think there's no other house like it in the world. It is the most amazing historic house I've ever seen. I've probably been there 6 or 7 times. The one thing I'll say for those of you who are interested, you have to book in advance, even before COVID, and you can't talk. You can't even open your mouth during a tour. And there are many reasons for that, but when you go, you'll figure all that out. The other thing to say is that there's no electricity at the Dennis Seaver's house. So I recommend you go at night because the entire house is lit by candle and gas, and it's an astonishing experience, particularly if you go during Christmas time when it's all decorated for Christmas with incredible 18th and 19th century Christmas celebrations. And lastly, I want to thank Ken for mentioning a National Trust in England house, the one in Cornwall, Lanhydrock, which is an astonishing place. And every time I hear the word Lanhydrock, I think of Hydrox, the down market version of Oreos. So let's get to some of your questions, Mr. Ken. The first one is the easiest one I'm going to give you. What states does Historic New England have houses in?
Okay. Well, we have them in all the New England states, except Vermont. So that's Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. We have an office in Vermont, and I have a staff person who works for me there. So we do programming, and we've got a wonderful web app on our Burlington Immigrant Market program that we're developing now.
Thank you. This is a question that I know is very hot topic in the UK as well as in the US. What do you think, Ken, are audience's reactions to slave stories being prominently featured in historic houses?
I think the numbers show that people want to hear these stories, and there have been studies done by the American Alliance of Museums that right now, particularly what we've lived through in the last year, people are attuned to these stories, and those sites which are telling these stories, their attendance is going up. I think you have to be very, very sensitive on how this is done. And that's why there's organizations like the Sites of Conscious that tell you or teach site how to go about this. And so I think it is important. We can't keep these stories hidden. We can't choose not to tell them. They're part of history. We need to tell them.
Thank you. And I have to say, for those of you who are unaware, this has been a huge issue. This is part of the culture wars that are going on. Many white groups don't like to hear, I should say white supremacist groups, white fragility, whatever you'd like to call it, do not want to hear stories about unpleasant things, and they don't want to hear stories about servants. They want to hear about rich people living in beautiful surroundings. So Ken, do you know what part of America has the most historic houses?
Oh, that's a good question, but I'd love your opinion on this. I would say New England.
Well, of course,
down.
I'm going to say that too, because I don't know, but I think it's true simply because we were here first and we have so many historic things. And I think it's also important to remember, as far as why we probably have more historic houses here, that like so many other things in America, historic preservation began in New England and specifically began in Boston. I know everyone's probably tired of me hearing me ring the bell for Boston, but the very first historic house that wasn't saved was the famous John Hancock Mansion on the top of Beacon Hill that was being torn down during the Civil War, and there was a campaign to save it, and it wasn't successful. It was torn down, replaced with houses. But that was the very first example of an attempt to save a historic house in America. And because of that, we know this for a fact, the Old South Meeting House, the Old South Church, where the Boston Tea Party was planned, that was going to be torn down about 15 years later after the Hancock Mansion was torn down. And the only reason it was saved was because people said, remember the Hancock Mansion. And because of that, we have historic preservation in America. So like anybody with any sense knows, all good things start in New England.
Well, Kurt, I'm gonna step in back for one second, because two things. One is that our founder of Historic New England, Appleton, is considered the first professional preservationist in all of America. and he was inspired because the Hancock House was a loss. Also,
I didn't know that. That's great, Ken.
yep. And the other thing is your hometown, though, I think, has the most historic sites than any in the United States. And that's like 300 in Philadelphia. That includes Germantown. Yeah. According to Pew, I'm pretty sure with that.
Well, you know, I have to say, I don't want to be disloyal to Philadelphia. I'm very proud of being a native Philadelphian. And to give that boost, the first time I came to Boston on vacation and I saw our equivalent of Independence National's historical park, which is the old State House in downtown Boston, I said, this is it? This is a pathetic little one building in the middle of skyscrapers. Whereas for those of you who haven't been, if you go to Independence Hall in Philadelphia and all the things around it, it is blocks of historic buildings. And you can see them oftentimes as they were seen in the 18th century. There are very few places in America where you can do that. And I should also mention that Philadelphia is 3 times bigger than Boston. So let's talk about the Tenement Museum, because I know that's something that is near and dear to your heart. Ken, can you tell us what you think the future of the museum is? We have a number of people who've written in to say how much they enjoyed visiting there.
Oh, I'm not an expert. I'm reading what's in the New York Times. I've talked to some people close to it, and I think it's going to be back, and I think it's going to be back stronger. A lot of people stepped up when there was a threat to close it, but I cannot talk details about it. But I think it's an amazing, amazing place.
And I want to say, to echo what Ken just said, people that I know who were not interested in the least in historic museums, historic house museums, go to the Tenement Museum and are blown away. It is one of the most engaging museums in America. And I think one of the reasons that it is because it's telling a different story. Back to what we said a few seconds ago about people not always being interested in seeing things that aren't beautiful old houses that are preserved with great interiors. It tells a different story. It's muddy, it's dirty, it's real. And I think the success of the Tenement Museum is very much related to the fact that people do want to hear different stories. And we had somebody who wrote in on the comments something that I think is interesting, which is that this person believed that senior citizen boards are the biggest problem with historic house museums because they don't want to change. And it's important to remember that most historic houses around America are owned by small charities, usually owning just that one house. And they are oftentimes dominated by volunteers who very much care about and are very passionate about their house, but who don't want to see new things happen. And this is a death knell for any organization, not to change with the times and to see new things going on. And I think I've seen that here where I live in the Jamaica Plains section of Boston. We have a historic house called the Greeno House that was very resistant to change about 15 years ago. It was dying on the vine, and now it's a very vibrant part of the community. They have plays in the summer. They have movies on the lawn. They have all kinds of community involvements. And I think that's key for people to remember. If you're not big and famous, if you're not Mount Vernon or Monticello in America, you don't have a big story to tell. It's how do you get people in the door? And I think you see that in so many small houses like you do here at the Greeno House. It's getting the community engaged so it's not just a historic house. Because let's be honest, as much as I love historic houses, you can only see the inside of a historic house 3 or 4 times and then you're done. You're bored. So these houses have to do other things to get people engaged and make them feel like they're part of the community, particularly young people who really don't care about historic houses as we have traditionally presented them. But if we do new things and get new people involved, I think there's a bright future.
I agree.
Well, thank you, Ken, for that agreement. I think we will end it there today. If you have any other questions for Ken, you can email us at heritagetours@nehgs.org. Thank you again for joining us today, especially with all the ins and outs on technology. And I know we've heard from a number of people who were chatting with us throughout the country. Some places have had no problems hearing us. Some places have. Some places have lost electricity because of storms. So thank you for being so solid and staying with us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Yes, we have people all around the world who subscribe to our wonderful webinars. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. And here I just want to say something as well. That is the free part. I can't tell you the number of people who email me directly who tune into our webinars and say how much they appreciate the fact that they're free, because most arts and preservation organizations charge for their webinars. So we're very proud of that, and we'd like you to help us keep it that way. If you would like to learn more about our fabulous heritage tours, particularly the one to Philadelphia, you can visit us at americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Stay safe. Stay safe. How about that? Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you on our future online programs. Thank you so much for joining us all today. Goodbye for now.